And let's see. Yeah, so today what we're going to do is we're going to organize our code a little bit. And we'll see why that's necessary, but I'll talk about that loading stuff afterwards. And then we're going to look at the editor again for a second to start building out something, a scene, and then we'll look at how to import the scene that we create in the editor into our project. So I have my three.js demo here. I'm going to go to Edit Project, um, and I'll put a link to this in the voice channel chat. And right now I have the preview window open. I'm going to close this and yeah. hmm Yeah, that would be a good way to do it. Um, so you could put the loop inside another loop. Um, or you could make a function that has the loop in it and then make a loop that calls that function. Both of those would be good ways to do it. I could do a little demo of that actually, because that kind of relates to what I'm going to be talking about first of all. Um, yeah, that's a good one to do. So I'll show how to do that. Okay, so let's see. So here's my main project. I'm going to go to the script.js and I'm going to close this window a little bit. And then I have my preview open here. You can open the preview in like the other pane, but I like to see the full scale version of the preview. And I'm going to go ahead and open up my console in case there's any errors. So right now there's nothing in there that I need to worry about, but just want to have that open. Um, and so, yeah, the first thing I'm going to do is a little bit boring, but it's going to make things easier for the second part, which is to organize our code a little bit. And I think I had some leaves in here that I took out. Let's put those back in. Okay, there we go. And so to organize my code a little bit better, I'm going to create some functions. And one of the things that makes this a little bit tricky, and part of the reason I'm going to go over this now, is because a lot of the three.js examples that you'll see on their website and in other places will use something similar to what I'm going to do. So I'll show you guys an example of this. So I'm going to go to the three.js website uh, and take a look at some examples. And you could probably find this in like any example. I'm just going to choose this one and I'm going to click on the little brackets button down at the bottom right here to look at the code. And so I'm going to open up this code. And so let's see. They actually don't do this. So let me see if I can find another one. I think if I do something with controls, I'll be able to find an example of this. Let's try this one. Okay, so this is kind of what I'm talking about. Normally, a lot of the time when you see some example code, you'll see something that looks a little bit more like this here than what we've been looking at so far. And so in our code, you can see I just kind of start doing stuff. I'm like constant scene equals new three.js scene, camera, etc. Like all this code just like runs basically as soon as I start the website. But the way that this project is structured is a little bit different, where they define a bunch of variables here, and then they actually create variables for these different components, like the camera, controls, scene, render, all this different stuff. And then they have different functions that contain the main parts of their code. So they have this init function. That's just short for initialize, which like sets up the basic scene. So we can see all of that stuff happening in here. And then there's a bunch of stuff in here in this init function. They have a on window resize function that just handles if you change the window size, which is actually something we should probably go over at some point, but not today. Then they have their animate function and their render function as separate functions. And so this makes the code, this does a couple things for us. One thing is that it makes it it makes it easier to read the code because most of the important components are actually just contained right here. And we can make changes to the code here without having to go through and search for all these different variables. The other thing that happens is that if we need to load something in the code, we can wait until we've loaded our data before we initialize our scene, which is what we're going to need to be able to do today when we add in our scene from our editor. So these things aren't necessarily related, but one, we have to go over one before we can do the other, which is why we're kind of doing it in this order and doing them together. So hopefully that'll make sense as we start to see the way I'm going to adjust the code. But one thing that's a little tricky is that these constants are going to start to throw errors. You'll see that in here, I have like my constant camera, and that's what a lot of the kind of example code looks like. Here they have let camera, and that's because they define the camera here, but then the camera is initialized inside here. And then the camera is also updated probably over here somewhere, or maybe not. Oh, here it is. Yeah, so the camera is referenced over here. And so this is a good opportunity to kind of talk about the difference between constant and let, and also just go over how we need to structure code to make it work in general. So I'm going to go back over here. Since the Git stuff is not working the way I want it to, I think I'm actually going to start a new copy of this. So I think I'm going to remix my own project. So I'm going to click remix, and that way I can make some changes that will not overwrite the project the way it is, because there's some stuff in there that I may want to keep later. Let me see what this looks like. If I go to my projects now, what happens? Okay, so I have my three.js demo, and then I have this new one that I just created. So let's go back here and let's rename this. So this is settings, edit project details. So it makes up this kind of goofy name. I'm just going to call this MMP 310 3JS demo part 2 and click save. Okay, and I'll put a link in here. Uh, and so I wanted to do this part with Git, but the way it's set up in Glitch is not really going to work for what I want to do. So maybe for our next project, we'll use local files and just figure it out that way. Because I do want to go over some more Git stuff at some point, but for today, we're just going to create a new project file. So let's make this a little bit bigger. And now I can start editing. So notice that I have these different parts of my scene. I have like the setup, I have the lighting, and then I have the scene itself where I have the ground, and I have these different parts of my scene, the clouds, and then I have my animation down here. So I'm going to start separating these into their own functions so that I can organize my code a little bit better. And the first function I'm going to do is called the initialize function, which in a lot of three.js projects you'll see as function init. And it just looks like that. And what this means is like this is setting up our scene. So let me put a little comment here. Init, it means, or let's just say init, initialize, set up the three.js scene. So all the basic stuff is going to go in here. There's no like necessarily like hard rules about where different parts of your project should go. Like you could put your lighting in a separate function. Usually in three.js you see the lighting in the main function. But you can kind of decide where you want different things to happen. It doesn't necessarily have to happen the same way every time. So like in the example I was looking at, pretty much everything that we've done actually happens in their init function here. Like they set up the camera, they set up the scene, they set up the lighting, they actually create these materials for the clouds, they create a moon, they do all this other stuff, they're creating stars, they're adding their renderer, they're setting up their controls, like everything is happening in this init function. I'm going to break it up into some slightly different functions just to do an example. But let's start with our init function. So our init function handles like some of our basic scene things. So one thing I might want to use is like my scene. And so if I put constant scene into my init function, we're going to get an error here. And so let's look at why. So I'm going to reload this. Oh, I have to open the right demo pane. So let's go to now that I have a new project, I have to open a new window, preview, and we see nothing renders. And so I'm going to open the console to figure out what's going on. And look at what it says, scene is not defined. So here I have defined the scene, but it's inside this function. So remember, this function has its own scope. And so anything that I create in here doesn't exist outside of this. And so if we look at where that error is actually happening, it's not in our init function, but later in our code when we try to add stuff to the scene. And so if I want to be able to use the scene down here to add my lighting, then I need the scene to be a global value. So I'm going to put my global variables up here. And so if I define my variables up here, then they'll be accessible to any different function in my project. And so what I'll do is just declare that scene exists. I'll put it here. And so I'll declare the scene here, and then I'll assign the scene here. So remember that when I say something like constant scene equals new three dot scene, this is doing two things at one time. It's initializing a variable called scene, and it's also assigning that variable to a three.js scene. But we don't have to do these at the same time. What I can do instead is I can initialize my variable here. So this is initialization. And that's not to be confused with our init function, although it is similar. This is creating the variable, or we can also call this declaration. We're declaring that this variable exists. So then in here, I'm assigning the variable. So I'm separating those steps. So this is assignment. And those are just big fancy words to describe what's happening in these parts of the code. And so this is a good step because I'll be able to now use the scene in the init function, but I'll also be able to use it down here when I add my lighting. But the problem that we're going to have is that it's not going to let me use a constant anymore. So I'm going to refresh this, and I'm going to have a new error. And it says missing initializer in const declaration. Oh, actually, that's a different error than what I was expecting. But yeah, it makes sense because if we're going to create a constant, it needs to be initialized. We're not allowed to just create it and then change it. So a constant can't change. So that's a different error than what I was expecting, but it kind of means the same thing. So what we'll do is we'll just change this to let. And now it will let us run our code. But we haven't run the init function yet, so we have to call the init function. So for now, I'm just going to call it right here so that it happens, before we try to use stuff. So I'm going to call the init function. And so now our code works again. So what happens here, so this looks more complicated, but it will eventually lead for us to have better organization of our code. So we initialize the scene variable. We create this function which will assign the three scene to the variable, but the function doesn't actually run itself. So after we declare the function, we have to actually call it. So this is like invoking or calling a function. And that's kind of the same thing that happens down here. Like we define animate and then we call animate here. And so yeah, now we have this scene and it's assigned here. And now when we try to add stuff to the scene down here, it'll work. So we're going to move a lot of stuff into our init function. So all of this other stuff that we have, let's move this back. I don't like how, sorry, glitch has changed the way this looks. So I'll move my camera in here. And each time I move a new component into my init function, I have to add this global declaration. So I can do that using a comma. So I can say scene, comma, camera. And this saves me a little bit of time because instead of writing let camera down here, I can just add the camera to this part. So I'm saying let scene, and then the comma means apply the same thing to the camera. So I have let scene camera, just remove the constant here. So I have a camera now, and let's delete this. And for these lines of code, I can just copy these and paste them in here. I don't have to like change anything because the camera's already been declared here. So I don't have to, add the camera up here because the camera already exists. Okay. So let's do the same thing with our renderer and our controls. So I'm just going to take the renderer, I'm going to copy everything except the constant, and I'll do a new line just to keep it organized. And then I'll just put these lines of code inside the init function, and then I'll delete them. And let's say I forgot to add my render up here in my global variables. If I reload my scene, I'm going to get another error. Oh, actually, I'm not because JavaScript does variable hoisting, so never mind. It'll actually add, since I didn't use any declaration here, JavaScript, what it does is it actually adds these variables to the global scope, which is a little weird, but we're just gonna add it up here anyway. So we'll say render, and then our last bit is our controls. So I'm gonna do the same thing. I'll copy the controls and paste them in here, and then just delete this. And then I have scene, camera, render, and controls. And you'll see a lot of three.js scenes that look like this. We're just kind of saying these are our basic components, and then our init function will set up those components. And now a nice thing that you can do in pretty much any code editor is I can collapse this init function. And so now I'll be able to also see the different parts of my program a lot more easily because I can collapse large parts of the code so I don't have to scroll down this page to find different parts of the code. And then once I've collapsed it, I can just click on this little arrow to open it back up. So most text editors will let you do something like that. And so that's going to make it a lot easier to see all my code once we do that with everything else. So yeah, let's go back to our example and we'll see that it's starting to look more similar. So here we have let camera control scene render stats. So pretty much the same thing except we don't have these stats. We could add those at some point if we want to. And then it has some other stuff in here. And then it calls the init function down here, and then it does the init function here. So let's keep going. And so even though they do their light, yeah, go ahead. Yes, yeah, yes. So I can actually move the init call up here, and that might be a little confusing because we're used to our code happening in sequence. But when JavaScript reads your code, it translates it into something that the computer can understand, and so it doesn't actually read your code in order when it's running the code. And when our JavaScript is compiled to machine code, it actually separates our functions from everything else and it reads those functions first. So we can actually call a function before it exists in this case. There's some cases where you can't, but I won't go into that right now just to avoid confusion. But yeah, so we can move our function calls to anywhere in the code. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense because you can call your functions lots of different places. And so you might have a bunch of functions, but you might be calling them in all sorts of different places in your code. So it makes sense for us to read the functions first before we actually try to execute them, which is what the JavaScript compiler does. But that's a good question to notice. Okay, so let's set up our lighting. And so one thing that you'll notice here is that we don't actually need our values to be global if we aren't using them anywhere else. So for example, when I create my lighting, I'm adding them to my scene, but I'm not referencing my lighting anywhere else in my project. So if I put this in a function, it won't actually affect anything else I do. So if I make a function called lighting, and I can now get rid of this comment because we know this is about lighting. So let's just put this in here. And I'm just moving everything over. Once we enter this new scope, we want to make sure to indent everything. And so now I have this lighting function, and if I don't call it, it's not gonna run. So if I refresh my page, um, we can't see anything because there's no lighting. But if I add my lighting here, so I'm going to call lighting after I initialize the scene. Now we should have that lighting back. And because I never actually reference the lighting anywhere else, it doesn't really matter that these lights are created inside the lighting function because I'm not going to change them anywhere else. There's no real reason to put them in the global scope with our scene variables. If there were things that we wanted to set globally, like the color, that would make sense. Like I could put something like constant ambient color and grab this color value from here. And now if I put ambient color into that ambient light, now I can close my lighting function. And here's my scene. If I want to change that ambient color, let me get a color picker up so I can find a nice color. So I'll go to like maybe a light blue for my ambient. And so I'll just copy this hex value and paste it in here. So now I can have global variables, so I don't have to root around in my function to find the code that I want. And that looks pretty good, but it's a little too bright for an ambient color. We got to remember that ambient is added on top of everything else. So let's just get a darker version of that color. And we'll see that it still actually does add a little blue highlight, even though it's a darker color now. So that looks pretty good. So that's another way that it's useful to have global variables is I could put colors or positions or other values from all sorts of different parts of my code up here in my variables so I can change things without having to root around in the functions themselves. And you'll see examples of that again if we go back to our three.js example. They have things for the radius, the tilt, the rotation speed, cloud scale, moon scale. So all of these things can be changed to change the way that this example works, which let me reload because it's not centered anymore. So yeah, we could change, I actually don't see the moon on here, but I wonder if we, oh yeah, we can move. I forgot that you can actually drive this scene. I still don't see the moon though. But anyway, you can see things like the cloud scale and things that affect the way that the scene looks. So we have our lighting function. So let's add in our scene function. So we'll say function scene. And another thing I can do here, if I don't want to do a bunch of moving around, I can just delete the curly bracket down here and then just go through and kind of move all this stuff over. Oops. And I can also just select a bunch of lines and I'm hitting Command and the right bracket to move everything over at once. And so let's do our trees down here. Oop, there we go. And our clouds down here. And again, these are things that we don't need to be in the global scope. So now that I've added this scene, I just have to make sure to close it at the bottom. So since there's all this code here, I just want to see this is highlighted. And if I scroll back up, it should match the scene function here. There we go. So now I can close that. And now I just invoke the scene setting. And now look how nice this looks if I close my animate function. I'll get rid of this comment because this is obviously doing animation. And I can even put my animate call up here. And so this is kind of the order we want to do stuff. Initialize the basics of the scene, set the lighting, render our scene, and then animate to continue rendering. And the animate also updates our controls, etc. And so now I have this really nicely organized scene. Whoops. Oh, I can't name the scene because I already have scene here. So my function name can't be the same as my variable name. So let's go back to scene and I'll just call this scenery because it is scenery. That'll be a better function name. And so now we can reload. And there's our scene. That looks good. And so look how much simpler this is. Like if I zoom out a little bit, with our code all folded up, it's very easy to see everything. And of course, if I unfold all of this code, suddenly it's very, very large again. And I can separate these things further. Like I can go in and I could have functions for the ground and trees and put them in different places. So I can kind of organize my code even more granularly if I want to. Um, but I just want to do the one thing that Gal was describing real quick, and then we're going to go to the second part of what we're working on today. So um, Gal was kind of asking, I'm going to format this so we can read it better. So yeah, Gal was asking about doing a loop multiple times, which he's doing to add multiple layers of clouds to his scene. And so if we want to do that, obviously the easy way to do it is to just grab this entire loop and just copy the whole thing and paste it. But if we do that and put it in another loop, that will be, it'll look kind of crazy. Like we'll just have a lot of different code blocks. And so a slightly better way to do that is to do kind of what Gal was describing. We can add a function to handle this part, and then we can make another loop that just calls that function. So that'll be a nice clean way to do it. So let's actually do this over here. Um, or we can actually do it within this main scene function. So you can have functions inside functions. So that may be a good thing to show. So I'm going to get rid of some of these comments since this is from the earlier demo. Um, and I'm just going to say this is our clouds. And this is really like a layer of clouds. So let's make that a function. So we'll say function cloud layer, and we'll put this whole loop in here. So I'm just going to cut and paste, and then I'll select that and move it over. So now we have a cloud layer. So right now we've defined the function, but you'll notice there's no clouds. Once I put that stuff in a function, I have to call the function to make it work. So I can call the cloud layer here. Now we'll get our layer of clouds back. And so now I've got some clouds. That's pretty cool, but let's do it multiple times because we have a function. We can call it as many times as we want. So I'll call it again. I'll say cloud layer. And now we have two layers of clouds, but they're in the same place. So that's where having a function with arguments comes into place. And this is a good thing to review as well. If I want my clouds to be on different layers, I have to figure out where this layer is. So we can see right here, this constant y equals math.random times 5 plus 50. That 50 is really where our y value is. So let's make that an argument so we can change it. And this is the nice thing about using loops, using functions. It makes it really easy to make simple changes to our code. So let's put a y value here. We'll just say y. And we actually can't call it y, can we? Because we already have a y. So let's give it a more specific variable name anyway. We'll call this cloud height. Or actually, it's really a layer height. Let's call this layer height. Okay, so then we'll replace this 50 with layer height. And then we can put 50 in our first layer. And if we put 100 in our second layer, so this 50 will go here. And the first time we run it, all of our clouds will be at 50 plus whatever this random value is. And then if we run it again, we'll have 100 here. That will become our layer height. And all of our clouds will be at that 100 plus our random value. So let's do that again. And there we go. We have two cool, nice layers of clouds. And we can do that with all sorts of different values. I'll do it with one more just as an example, and then we'll kind of move on. So another thing that we have is the layer sort of distribution, I guess I'll call it, this number 5 here. If that number was just 1, or let's actually just say it's 0. So if that number was just 0, all of our clouds would be exactly on the same y value on our two different layers. Let's zoom out a little bit and we'll see that. Okay. But if it was something large, like 100, then the clouds will separate a lot more. And so you can't even really see where one layer starts and the other layer ends. Okay, so let's make that a variable. So we have the layer height. Let's also have the layer distribution. And so this is just how much it can randomly be distributed. And so I'll put that there, and then we just need a number here. So I'll do like 5, which was our original value for the first layer, and I'll do 10 for our second layer. Let's just see what that looks like. Okay, so if I zoom out, so it's a little bit hard to see. I might make it more dramatic. So let's say, so let's make sure we did that right. So there's a layer distribution, layer distribution. So let's do for our layer distribution, let's do 5 and then let's do 100. That way we'll really be able to see the difference. Okay, so yeah, you can see there's like a lower layer, which is very flat. There's not very much distribution. And then there's a taller layer, which it has a lot more distribution. So that's a good way to review adding arguments into our functions and using functions to kind of make make it so we can repeat this cloud layer very easily. So there's a lot of other places that we could do that, but let's continue with the rest of the content for today. So I'm going to collapse this scenery and I'm going to collapse all of my other stuff. And so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a scene in the three.js editor, and then I'll import it into this scene. So there's two parts to that. Um, yeah, hopefully we'll be able to do that in the next little bit, and then have some time left over for you guys to try it out. Any questions before I move on to that part? All right. So let's make a scene and then we'll talk about why we're doing it this way. So remember, if we go to three.js.org and go to the editor, this is just like a GUI editor where we can create a 3D scene using three.js components. So it's a little bit like, using Photoshop or whatever, or an image editor, except we're working in 3D. So for some of you guys, if you've taken like Animation 401 or you've done some 3D design, this should look pretty straightforward. If you've never done any 3D design before, this may look kind of complicated because there's a lot of different components. But it's very simple because it just has the three.js parts in it compared to like using, Cinema 4D or Blender or something like that. So we'll just go over some of the basics. Also, if you do use like Cinema 4D or Blender, you can also import stuff from there into here or into your other three.js scenes. So you can go to like import um, button here, and then I don't have anything readily available, but you could import different types of 3D files. But anyway, I'm just going to make something like this. For the designs I was doing before, I was utilizing like loops and random, making things that would change, and it's good to do that with code. For doing something with an editor, it's better to do stuff where it's like it's always going to be the same and it's kind of a unique object so that it wouldn't really make sense to do it in code. Um, so I'm just going to add something into my scene. I guess what should I add? Let's take a look here. I have like a tree. I have some grass. I'll just add like a bench. I think I've done that before. And I can actually duplicate something that I import. So it's not necessarily something that you can't recreate. But I'd rather do a bench in my editor than in code because it's going to be a little bit easier. But I'll try to do it quickly. So when I'm using the editor, if I want to add objects, I just go to add. And for a bench, I'm going to start with a box. And I can uh, zoom in using the scroll wheel. You could probably use the trackpad to do this as well. I definitely recommend using an external mouse for this type of stuff, but you can do it with a trackpad. With the right mouse button, I'm rotating, and with the with the left mouse button, I'm rotating around, and with the right mouse button, I am panning. And then remember that there's a gizmo right here. So if I want to see what it'll look like in my scene, this is what our normal three.js scene looks like with the Z pointing at us and the Y going up and the X going to the right. But you can move this around to see different perspectives on the scene. Okay, so for my bench, I can also click on this box, and then if I hit F, it'll focus the box. So if I like go over here somewhere, but I want to find my box, I can click on the box in my scene view here, and then I can just hit F, and it'll bring me over here. I wonder if there's a way to. No, this all looks normal. Okay. There's a lot of stuff in here. I'm not going to go over everything, but let's just go over a couple of basics. So let's add a material so it's not just black. Although we don't have any lighting in the scene, so we should add a light. Let's add a ambient light and just make it light gray so we can see. Okay. And I can delete that if I don't want it in my main scene. So here's my box. Let's go to material. We'll use the mesh standard material. I'm going to make it kind of brown because it's going to be the basis of my bench. So that looks good. And so then I'll go to the object and I can use like the scale buttons. I can scale it up and down this way or like this. Or in the editor, I can go here and change this is like the move tool. So it'll move the box. This is the rotate tool to rotate the box. And this is the scale tool to scale. And what does this do? I don't remember. So let's undo those transformations. And so for this, I'm just going to have like the bench part that you sit on. And so, oops. So I want to go to scale. And I'm going to squish it down a lot. And then I'll elongate it on the X. And if you want to just use the properties over here, you can kind of like do things with a little bit more accuracy. Like if I'm just dragging, you'll see that the scale is like going over the place. But if I get close to something I like, I can just put in 4 and that will be fine. And then this one, if I want to get it skinnier, I can do like 0.1. And that looks pretty good for um, the part of my bench that I want to sit on. So let's bring this up a little bit and let's add another box and we're going to make the legs. So I'm going to scale this in this way, in this way. Okay, that looks pretty good. Let's give it same material. Oh, the annoying thing here is I can't like save a material and apply it to different stuff. Well, let me do that. Yeah, I can't do that. What if I name the material bench material? Okay, if I go back to this box, um, will it let me choose that? I feel like there probably should be a way to do that, but I'm going to ignore it for now. Okay, whoops. So I'm going to hit F to focus that, and let's change the color. Oh, I'm on the other box. Okay, so let's rename this object. Let's call this the bench seat. And then we'll call this the bench leg 1. Okay. Um, and so now what I'm going to do is just move this over to where it should go, over here. Okay, that looks good enough. And now what I want to do, let's lock in this position. So the scale is like 0.01 and 0.01. Oh no, that's too small. Is it 0.1? Yeah, it's 0.1 by 0.1. And so I want to finish this before I make the rest of the legs, so I know it looks good. So let's change the color again, something brown. And then now what I can do is clone this box. So I'm going to go to Edit and go to Clone. And so now I have bench leg 1 and bench leg also 1. So let's change this to bench leg 2. And it has the bench material, so that's nice. And then I'll just move this over here. And then I'll select both of these. Can I do both? No. Can I do both over here? No. Okay, that's fine. So then I'll just clone this one. So I'll go to Edit, Clone, and move it all the way over here. Okay, I'm not doing this very accurately, but I don't really have time to do that. So let's clone this last bit. Okay, so now we have our little bench legs, so that looks pretty good. Um, and last thing is we want our bench back. So I'm gonna clone the bench seat. I'm gonna click edit, clone, and let's just move this up a little bit. Let's call this bench back. And now I'm just gonna rotate this around a little bit and then move it back here. Okay, so that looks pretty good. It's not perfect, but it's good enough for this example. Let's move it in a little bit. Okay. So what I want to do now is just get this into my scene. So one thing I want it to do first is get it a little bit more organized. So in my scene view over here, I have like the bench seat, I have the legs, I have all this stuff. And so I want to put this into one object so I don't have to deal with it as a bunch of different things. And there's an easy way to do that. I'm going to click on my scene and I'm going to go to add. And what I want to add is called an empty. So let's find that here. Oh no, sorry, I'm thinking about Blender. What I want to add is a group. So I'm going to add a group. I'm going to call the group bench, and then I can add these components to the group. And the other thing that's nice about this is that the group will have like an origin, and I can move everything relative to that. So first I want to make sure that the bench, so first, okay, here's my group, and I just want to, so I can just drag these items into this bench group. Oops. Okay, so now I have my bench here and I can move the whole group. So if I select the whole group, I can move the whole group around, I can rotate the whole group, and I could clone the whole group. So that gives me a lot of stuff to work with. So let's undo that rotation. Anyway, I'm almost ready to export this. I want to delete my ambient light for now. I don't know if there's a way to export. Oh yeah, I can export. Okay, maybe I'll leave the ambient light and see if there's a way to export just the bench. So anyway, what I'm going to do is export this scene and load it into the scene that I'm working on for my main project. There's obviously a ton of other settings that I could do over here, but I'm not going to go into them now. You guys can play around with these, and if you have questions, we could go over them later. But yeah, so we've got our bench. I'm going to go to export. And I think what I want to do is, if I do export scene, that's going to create this JSON file. I'm going to see, can I open this? We're going to have to open that in um, our script. Let's see if there's a way to view that. No, I don't want to do that. Okay, so I can export the scene. That's everything in the scene. I can export an object, which I assume is whatever I have selected. Let's test that. So I'm going to export this object. And then I can export geometry, which says the selected object doesn't have geometry. So I'd have to select something. So I think what I really want to do is export object while I have the bench selected. I'm hoping that that will keep all of my data together. So export object is what I probably want. So now I can import this. And so let's look up how to import. So I'm going to go to the three.js website and go to documentation, and I'm going to go to import. Okay, that doesn't have anything. Let's try loader. Okay, so we're going to use a loader, and let's see if we can find some code for this object loader. There we go, perfect. Okay, so an object loader will load the object that we created. And so here's where we get to the part that I was kind of referencing earlier, which is that when we load an object, we need our browser to do this before we render our scene, because otherwise the object will take a little while to load, and then it won't exist when we render our scene to start. So one of the reasons we organize our code is so that we can wait for our object to be loaded before we start to render our scene. Um, so we're going to do that. We have some code here to use. And so let's go ahead and add it into our project. So I'm going to go back to my glitch file. And so we're going to have to add this as an asset, I think. So I'm going to open this and go to assets. And I'm going to click upload an asset. And so here's my downloads folder. It's a bunch of stuff in here. But the thing that I want to download is the model. I think that's what it called my project, and it won't let me do it because it's JSON. So it only wants me to do images and stuff here. So this, I think it's going to make me treat this as a file. So I'm going to hit plus file and go to upload a file. And now I can choose model.json. I'm going to open this. And here it is. Let's read through this real quick. So basically, this is just a bunch of data that's related to what we created. So here's some metadata stuff. Here's some geometry. You can see it's a box geometry. Some materials. So we have this mesh standard material. Then we have this, oh, maybe this is not the right one. This doesn't have enough information in it. Let's delete this and see and take a look at the other one that I downloaded. So let's click plus on files, upload a file. This model one might have everything in it. Okay, yeah, here we go. This is better. Geometries, materials. So yeah, there's multiple geometries. There's a box geometry. There's multiple materials. So we have this random material. We have our bench material. Then we have an object bench. This is just a bunch of information that three.js uses. So this is our actual data. So this looks pretty good. I'm gonna make sure this is in our data file. So I'm gonna rename this data slash bench.json. And so this will make a little data folder for us. And now we can load this bench into our project. Okay, so let's go back to script.js. And so again, as I mentioned, we need to load the bench before we render the scene because loading a file takes some time. And if we try to render the scene before we load the file, we're either going to get an error or it's not going to look right. So before we even call our init function, we're actually going to load our data. So let's make a new function called load. And if you remember from P5, this is like the preload function when you preload images and audio and stuff like that. So we're kind of making our own preload function, but we're just going to call it load. And then what's going to happen is our load function is actually going to call these other functions once it's done. So let's go to our object loader example. So first we need to create a loader. So I'm going to copy that and paste it in here. So we'll create an object loader first. And I don't think we're going to use this more than once, so I don't need to make it a global variable. And then we just load the resource URL. So I'm just going to copy this part and paste it in here. And this is going to be inside our project. It's going to be at data slash bench.json. So that's just a link to where this goes. That's our first argument for the loader. And then these three arguments are different functions, which are known as callbacks, which is a callback is a function that you put as an argument. We only need one of these. This isn't going to take very long to load, so we don't need to do on progress. And I don't think there's going to be an error, so we're not going to use the on error. We're just going to use this function. And all this is going to do is say add the object to the scene when it's done. We're not going to do that quite yet, but what we're going to do is init and then do that. So here's what we'll do. And so instead of so yeah, this might be a little bit confusing, but so I'm going to write a function directly into this argument like that. And this is known as a callback function. So I'll put a little note here that says callback. And a callback function is basically a function that waits for however long this data takes to load. Then we give it a function to handle that data. And so we can name this whatever we want. We're going to call this bench. And then inside our function, we decide what to do with it. And I'm actually going to put a different function here just to kind of like build our scene. So let's actually call this our setup function. We can continue doing stuff that's kind of P5e. So we'll say setup, or actually that's kind of confusing. Let's just call this onload. So we'll say onload, and then we'll put the bench in there. So it looks a little weird because we're basically just like passing this bench through this onload function. But that's the easiest way to do it. So we have a function load, and then we have a function onload to call once this data is loaded. So it seems complicated, but once we are done with this, we don't really have to worry about anything else. So now we have a function onload, and this is going to take a bench. If you have more stuff than just a bench, you can, call this scene or objects or whatever you want to put in there. You can have as much data as you want to. You can also load multiple things. I'm not showing that right now, but you can kind of chain loaders together so that it'll wait until everything is loaded and then call your scene. So what I'm going to do with my onload function is first I'm going to initialize the scene. So I have access to things like the scene and the camera. Then let's go ahead and add our bench to the scene. So we'll say scene dot add bench. And then we're going to call the rest of our stuff. So I'm going to take all this stuff and throw it in here. We'll add the lighting and the scenery, and then we'll start to animate. And so I'm going to comment these out because now we wait until we're done loading to do all this stuff, like the initialize lighting, scenery, animate. So hopefully this makes sense. It's a little bit complicated, but this is basically what we want to do. And so now we should reload the scene and we should be able to see a bench, hopefully. We'll probably get an error, but let's see what happens. Okay, we did get an error. So let's write in a quick on error function just to see what the deal is. Although the next one is on progress, so I'm just going to say undefined for on progress and then function error console.log error. I probably just spelled something wrong or got the path wrong, but let's take a look. Oh, I'm not getting anything. Oh, I didn't call load. Oh man, I'm such an idiot. Okay, we need to replace this whole thing with a call to the load function. And so we need to actually call the load function for this to work. There we go. But where is our bench? I'm not sure. It's probably inside this tree. Yeah, there it is. Whoops. So we need to move our bench because it's in the same place as the tree. So let's just move our bench, or we could move the tree, but let's just move the bench so I can get rid of this stuff. And so where do we want to do this? We can really do this wherever. Um, we could also just call on, let's do this. Let's take this out of here and put it up here. We'll just deal with this in the loader. So we can call on load, and that'll do all this initializing stuff. And then we don't have to worry about sending the bench over here. This will be a little bit simpler. And so then we can say bench dot position dot set, and let's move it over like 10 on X and see how that looks. There we go. There's our bench. The tree is really big compared to the bench, so we could scale the bench up. It also has some like legs that are inside the ground, so we could move it up one on the Y. That should be enough. Okay, now it's floating. So we'd have to play around with that a little bit. And I could go back. Actually, this is a good example of how I would adjust this. So let's say I've got my bench in here. I'm all excited, but I'm noticing that the legs are not lined up with the bottom of the scene. And so let's go back to the editor and just re-export this. Um, so here's my editor, here's my bench, and so what we need to do is the position, I move the bench up, but when we import that into the scene, it's going to be at 0, 0, 0. So what I really need to do is move everything inside the bench up. So let's see, can I do that? I can't select everything. That's something that I would like to be able to do, but that's okay. Let's just change the position of everything. And here, I'll just add a 1. All right, no, that's not really going to work. What's a good way to do this? Well, the problem with that is that it's still going to export the scene, and so it's still going to be added um, at 0, 0. Uh, but let's see what I could do is move this up and then I can just see what the position is. It's 0.495. So I'll just remember that. So I'll move this up so that it's lined up here and save. Well, I don't want to save. I want to go to File, Export Object. So select the bench, File, Export Object. And so that'll download. Now it's called Model 2 because I've downloaded multiple copies of it. Let's go to my files and I'm going to upload a file. Or actually, I think what I want to do is delete this first and then add Model 2. And then I'm going to rename Model 2 to data/bench.json. And so now it'll reload in the same place. And so now the legs are still down there, but now I know what the offset is. So I'll just add that to my code. So I'll go to bench.position.set 0.5, I think, on the Y. And okay, so now it's pretty close. I'm not sure if it's exactly right, but it looks close. So that's pretty good. And the bench is pretty small. If I wanted to scale it, I could also scale. I could say bench.scale.set 222. Oh, and I'm supposed to add spaces here. So that's a little bit bigger. That looks pretty good. And I probably want to scale after I do the position. So if I scale even more, let's do like 5, 5, 5. Now it's too big. Yeah, so now it's going below the thing again. But maybe that's not the end of the world. Let's move it over a little bit farther on X. Okay, that looks pretty good. And let's move it back a little bit. So I'll do like -5 on Z. Okay, so that looks nice. You have a little bench next to a tree. So that's a really simple example, but now you could create a lot more stuff inside the three.js editor and export it and import it into the scene. And so you pretty much just do the same thing. If you had multiple stuff, what you would want to do is a loader manager. So I don't know if we really need that, but um, loading manager. So if you have a lot of files, you can use a loading manager to wait for all of the files. But I don't think we'll really need that. If you guys want to go over that, we can another time. But I think this is obviously plenty of info to go over. Um, so yeah, well, it's already saved. So the link for part 2 is in the messages already. So if you want to remix this and try to add in your own stuff, you can do that. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to do. I'm just going to put a note here that says onload calls init, etc. So we remember where all this stuff is. And yeah, I'll put this up here. So clean that up a little bit. And there we go. Now we have a nice looking, really clean group of code with a bunch of nice functions. We've got our stuff organized a little bit. And because we have everything organized, we can load some data before we start our scene using the function load and the function onload with our loader function. Let me put the callback function in here because that's where it goes. Okay. So I'm going to stop recording.